And so it is. And amen. Thank you. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
And our topic for today is humanistic psychology. We did an overview last time. We talked about a number of different types of counseling psychology. One of them was humanistic, sometimes called existential humanistic. It's really the same thing. The term existential refers to existentialism, which is the philosophy from which the humanistic movement emerged. Usually this is referred to as humanistic psychology. And it is kind of an umbrella, a rubric for a particular approach to counseling. It is not a specific technique per se. There are certain characteristics of humanistic psychology, humanistic counseling, and they rest upon a certain set of assumptions. So that's what we're going to talk about this morning, is the assumptions that are part of humanistic psychology. And these assumptions are embedded in any form of counseling that embodies humanism. Most notably, the most popular would be the client-centered therapy of Carl Rogers, which we'll talk about next time, and Gestalt therapy, fathered by Fritz Perls, which we will not talk about specifically. So let's talk about humanistic psychology, specifically about Abraham Maslow, who is without a doubt the father of humanistic psychology. I've heard him referred to also as the father of transpersonal psychology, because in the later years of his professional life, he became very interested in the transpersonal aspect of psychology. So what characterizes the work of Maslow is that he recognized that at his time, which was in the 50s and 60s, psychology, counseling was interested only in a small segment of the population. If this is the human population, this being the so-called normal people, like us, hopefully, okay? And the abnormal people being the tail end of the bell curve. Psychiatry was interested basically in the small percentage at the end referred to as abnormal, and the goal was simply about bringing them up to a place of normality, getting them functional once again. That's the goal of psychoanalysis, is to make you a responsible citizen. The goal of cognitive behavioral therapy was to get you functional once again when something was broken or not working. And to this day, that's the vision of allopathic medicine. If you're sick, we'll give you a pill or something that will bring you back to so-called normality, whatever that is. If you're feeling normal and you want to feel supernormal, most physicians aren't able to do you much good because they don't see that as their function. Their function is to bring you from sick to normal healthiness. But Maslow was interested in another aspect of what we might call abnormality, and that is the people that were, in a sense, super healthy. Because he noticed that the folks at this end of the spectrum were as different from so-called normality as the folks that seemed to be pathologically mentally ill. He eventually referred to these people as self-actualizers. And he went into great detail researching and describing these folks. So his interest in psychology was not healing the sick as much as it was taking the so-called normal individual and helping them realize their fullest potential. And of course, that's our primary function in Unity as a pastoral counselor. We are not clinicians. We are not dealing typically with the mentally ill. We are dealing with normal people for the most part. And for the most part, people that come to Unity are normal people looking to self-actualize, even if they're not familiar with that particular language. That's what Unity is about becoming more than we are, about actualizing, realizing our fullest potential. So that's the framework for Maslow's work. That's the motivation for his work. And now I'd like to share some of the conclusions that he came up with as a result of his research. And I want to emphasize that this came out of his research. This is not based upon any particular philosophy or theology that he's quoting or subscribing to, but simply out of what he saw in his work with self-actualized individuals. One of the most basic premises in humanistic psychology is that of our essential nature. And you and I have a pretty good idea what that is. Once again, he did not ascribe any theological terms to it or any overtly spiritual language. He simply called it an essential nature. He said, we each have an essential nature that is intrinsic and unchangeable. So it can't be given to us and it can't be taken away. It's intrinsic within each of us. And it is unchangeable in the sense that it's fundamental to who we are. It's the foundation, the ground of our being, so to speak. And he noted that this essential nature is partly universal and partly unique. And I would say rather than call it partly universal and partly unique, which is implying that maybe we're 50% unique and 50% universal, I would say that it is both universal and unique. There are unique aspects to our essential nature, and there are universal aspects to our essential nature. In a way, that's true of all aspects of our nature. Our physical nature and our mental nature is both universal and unique as well. There's aspects of the human psyche, aspects of the human body that are universal, and there are aspects of the psyche and the body that are unique to each one of us. That's how we know one person from the other, is we're all unique. As the bumper sticker says, you are unique, just like everyone else, you see. So, a characteristic of the essential nature is that it is essentially good. In other words, it is essentially life-promoting and beneficial and supportive of our well-being. So it's not neutral. It is something that, in a sense, is the essence of what we need for our well-being. And a corollary to this is that evil is not intrinsic in human nature, but is a frustration of our basic nature. So that if evil exists, if evil behavior exists, if the appearance of evil exists, it's because our essential nature is somehow frustrated in its expression. And this, again, is very much in parallel with what Unity teaches. And Maslow says, if we permit this essential nature to guide our life, if we permit this essential nature to guide our life, we grow healthy and happy. If this essential nature is suppressed or denied, we get sick. That's a pretty strong statement. No matter what we may look like functionally, if we are suppressing our essential nature, we will get sick, or we are sick by definition. And he makes a very interesting distinction here. Please.
Point of clarification.
Yes.
Get sick, is that emotionally or is that physically or both?
Primarily psychologically. It can also refer to physical, but primarily psychological illness. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the question was, is it a physical sickness or a psychological sickness? And the answer is primarily a psychological sickness, possibly a physical sickness. Something he points out that is new to a lot of us is that health, again, psychological health, primarily, health does not necessarily mean the absence of the symptoms of illness. Pain may be a healthy protest against the crushing of our true nature. Conversely, sickness may be an absence of symptoms when we should have them. Okay? So the example I give is that if in the 1930s you were a happy, well-adjusted Nazi, that does not mean that you were a healthy individual. Okay? Because a healthy individual in a sick system will express symptoms of illness, of sickness. And those of you that are familiar with family systems theory know that oftentimes the healthiest child in a dysfunctional family will be the so-called problem child, because she or he will often act out the symptoms of dysfunction for the family, whereas everyone else has suppressed these symptoms. So it's very important to realize that we cannot judge sickness and health from a psychological point of view or from a spiritual point of view, as far as I'm concerned, based upon appearances. Somebody may be physically healthy and prospering, but if they're part of a dysfunctional system, if they're part of a system that is not healthy, that's not necessarily a healthy thing. And conversely, a person that is suffering in some way or is protesting in some way may be the healthy person in this situation. When we get to the work of Carl Jung, we'll discover that this is much of the work that he found. That in many ways, the patients in the asylums were healthier than the psychiatrists that were treating them. Because they were healthy in the eyes of the culture, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were any healthier than the people that they were calling sick. So we'll get to that later on. But this is a very important point, and I think it's important to emphasize. Now, once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that if someone is psychologically sick, that automatically they're healthy and the system they're in is screwed up. I'm not saying that, okay? What I am saying is if one is in a dysfunctional, unhealthy system, then it's healthy to not be happy, to not fit in. Our inner nature, the essential nature, is subtle. Very, very powerful, yet very subtle. That's one of the fascinating aspects of it. It's kind of like life itself, you know. It's very subtle, and it can easily be overridden by habit or cultural pressure. And virtually all of us have stories from our childhood where we have had some kind of an intuitive insight or an experience of our spirit or soul, and we share that with an adult, and we're told that's just fantasy, that's just nonsense, forget about it, and boom, there the lid goes on it that quickly, you see. And it may be, that lid may be on that for 20, 30, 40 years or longer, you see. So as essential and as powerful as this force is, it can also be overridden by habit, by cultural pressure, or by peer pressure, family pressure, so forth. However, this inner nature never disappears. Never disappears. Even though denied, it persists forever, pressing for actualization. In the Taoist philosophy, the essential nature is often used through or referred to through the metaphor of water. It's very much like water, very humble, takes the lowest position, takes the form of its container, but it's infinitely powerful and infinitely life-giving. Water is absolutely necessary for life, and water is referred to as the universal solvent. There's nothing that water will not dissolve. If you've ever seen the Grand Canyon, that will attest to the power of water, the humble little water, you see. And so it is with our essential nature. It may seem very subtle, this still small voice, incredibly subtle, barely noticeable, and yet it is incredibly powerful in its overall impact on us. Something else that may be new to us, or at least the languaging of it, is what Maslow talks about as our intrinsic conscience. We have an intrinsic conscience that insists that we be true to our inner nature. So this is not the conditioned conscience that says you're bad if you don't go to church on Sunday, or if you don't finish all your dinner, or whatever we have been taught. You see, that's not what he's referring to. He's referring to as what we might call a true conscience, the conscience that insists that we be true to ourselves. And when we are not true to ourselves, we experience something he refers to as existential guilt. And again, I want to be clear, it isn't guilt in the same sense that we necessarily feel bad or that we've done something wrong. This, in unity context, is often referred to as, or I've heard it referred to as, the divine discontent. It's when we experience something within us that says something's not right here. And we may look around and everything in our life, according to cultural standards, is absolutely perfect, you know. We've got the house, the family, the car, the job, the career, you know, all of the medals and so on and so forth. And yet there's something inside of us that says that there's something missing. You're not doing what you need to be doing, you see. That's what Maslow would refer to as existential guilt. And he recognized that a lot of the maladies that plagued individuals that he worked with did come out of this sense of existential guilt. That it wasn't that there's something broken in them that needed to be fixed, but quite the opposite. They were hanging out here when their essential nature was calling them to move up and move forward into self-actualization. So in the counseling practice, in humanistic counseling practice, that's in the back of the mind of the counselor at all times, is in what way is the essential nature being repressed or stymied? And in unity, that's a question we ask, maybe in slightly different words, but in what way is this person blocking, unconsciously typically, But in what way is this individual blocking the full expression of the divine within them, in them and through them? So this is, using Maslow's language, this is the existential guilt. And again, if you have any questions or comments, I invite you to just write them down, because we'll take time for discussion when we finish the taped lecture. Maslow is perhaps most famous for what's called his hierarchy of needs. He recognized that human needs are hierarchical. And what this means, speaking of hierarchical needs, without water, nothing happens. You have this in your handout as well. Our most basic needs are our survival needs. If we can't breathe, nothing else matters, okay? So if your congregants can't breathe, stop preaching and help them breathe, okay? Likewise, food and water comes as a close second to that, you see. And whatever the physical needs of the individual are, that of course comes first. Once those needs are met, then the next level of need to emerge is that of safety. Physical safety first, and then psychological safety. Nothing happens if there isn't a sense of safety, and that's a big part of ministry. That's a big part of counseling ministry, pastoral ministry, is to provide safety, not just physical, but psychological as well. And once these needs are met, then the next one that arises is the need for love and belonging. The need to be cared for, the need to be part of a community, be part of a family. When that need is met, then the next need that arises is for autonomy, self-esteem, to be an individual, to have a sense of self, to feel good about who one is. And beyond that is the need, we've talked about this, the need to self-actualize. And this is the need to fulfill our deepest potential. And we'll talk some more about that later. This is an early model. Later on in Maslow's work, he refined this model and he added another level, which I don't know if these are his words or mine, but basically it's the level of self-transcendence. It's more of a, that's the transpersonal aspect of it. And ultimately, our deepest need is to go beyond our personal self, beyond our individual. And that's where the spiritual dimension is addressed. So, here's the hierarchy of needs in a statement. The principle that binds together the multiplicity of human motives is the tendency of a new and higher need to emerge as the lower need is gratified. Throughout history, it's been known that the nations that are most likely to rebel against their leaders, especially if there's a dictatorship or a monarchy, the ones that are most likely to rebel are not the ones that are living on the edge of subsistence, but the ones that are going beyond the level of subsistence, that have met the needs of survival and safety and basically are looking for the higher needs to be expressed. And that's what is sometimes known as the revolution of rising expectations, is that when one level is met, then the next level emerges. And sometimes leaders will make the mistake of thinking, well, if only I take care of this particular need, everybody will shut up and leave me alone. And that doesn't happen, because then the next level arises, you see. And we can see that in our own times as well. Now, when we talk about lower and higher, these are lower needs, these are higher needs, where there's no moral or ethical connotation of that. We're simply talking about which ones take priority. The lower needs are more basic. They take priority. They're no less important or less moral than any of the other needs. The first four needs are goal-oriented and press toward their own elimination. These basically Maslow referred to as D needs or deficiency needs. Deficiency meaning simply they arise out of a sense of deficiency. And again, there's no judgment connected with this. But if we're hungry, there's a deficiency of food. If we're thirsty, there's a deficiency of water. Okay? If we're afraid, there's a deficiency of safety, protection. If we feel unloved, lonely, or disconnected, there's a deficiency of love and belonging, and so forth. Okay? So each one of these are kind of like a hunger, so to speak. They're satisfied by filling up that emptiness. They're temporarily satisfied, and then the next level emerges. The self-actualization he called a being need. And the being need is open-ended. In other words, the need for self-actualization is never fully satisfied. Because the more we express it, the more we want to express it. Classic example is with creativity. If you're an artist, a musician, a writer, a poet, you don't write one book or paint one painting or write one piece of music and say, okay, that needs satisfied, let's go on to something else. No, that stimulates you to do even more, you see. So the need for self-actualization actually increases with its fulfillment. That's what I mean by it's open-ended. Another characteristic of the being need, the self-actualization need, is that it is an end in itself. The other needs are there to fill an emptiness, a void. But once that void is filled, then the next need arises. You know, we're hungry, and we get our belly full, and then there's a need to take a nap, you see. And then there's another need shows up, and another need shows up. And we get bored. There's a need for entertainment or something. But with a being need being expressed, it feeds on itself. It satisfies itself. Now, it's interesting that, let's take an example of an artist, the well-known starving artist. One can create a work of art out of a sense of survival, right? One can create a work of art out of the need to be loved or the need to feel good about oneself. But we all know to create a masterpiece, it can't come from these levels. It has to come from this here, where the art is an end in itself. So what we're doing, we can be doing the same thing, writing a book, painting a picture, and it could be for any one of these reasons. But the true self-actualization is when we do something just to do it. When we paint to paint, when we sing to sing. You know, as someone once said, we sing for the same reason the bird sings, because it's its nature to sing, you see. Not because we're doing it to get money or we're doing it to get praise and so forth. I mean, that may be a byproduct, and that's great when that happens, but that's not the primary reason. Or if it is, it's likely that we're not going to create a true work of art. Growth-oriented people, in other words, people that tend to be functioning more at this level here, the B level folks, growth-oriented people are more self-directed and free from dependency on the environment. So they're oriented toward growth. In other words, their motivation for what they do is out of self-actualization. It's not to fulfill some deficiency. They rely less on learned behavior and are more spontaneous. When one is at the level of self-actualization, one lives one's life out of a sense of play. There is no work. There's only play. And it doesn't mean that we don't do the things that look like work, but we do them from a sense of play, which is a sense of creativity, you know. Play is self-actualization, a form of self-actualization. If you ask a group of 4-year-olds that are playing, what's the purpose for what you're doing? You're going to get a blank stare. What are you talking about? You don't play for a purpose. You play to play, you see. And that's what this self-actualization is. It's that we don't do what we do for a purpose, to get a paycheck and so forth. We do it because it's play. We do it because it's expressing the joy of being. Deficiency people, that is, folks that are operating more out of the need to fill some deficiency here, tend to see others as need fillers. In other words, I need you for a paycheck. I need you to love me. I need you to think well of me so that I'll think well of myself. Okay, that tends to be more the motivation of those functioning at the D level, if you will. D love, deficiency love, is conditional, possessive, and is limiting to the other. By the way, this is typically what we call love in our culture is I love you because of what you do for me, or what I'm hoping you'll do for me. That's 99% of what we call love. That's what Maslow would call D love or deficiency love. B love, being love, is non-possessive and accepting. It doesn't use the other person or need the other person. And he makes an interesting statement here. He says, it may be essential for healthy development. In other words, if children have not experienced B love from their parents, if they've experienced only D love, deficiency love, in other words, if the parents love the child out of their own need. The need to be a good parent, or the need to feel good about themselves, or the need for the child to like them. If they experience that, that's not healthy for the child. That for a child to be healthy, and this is a hypothesis, this is not something we can necessarily prove, but he's saying that being love is really the kind of love that nurtures the soul of the one who's loved. De-love, which tends to be more conditional and possessive, actually is limiting to the other person, even though it may feel good at first. I think I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of human growth, and then we'll finish up what we don't finish today next time. Again, the word growth, being all you can be, reaching one's full potential, is what Maslow was all about. And again, I want to emphasize, when we talk about being people and deficiency people and things like that, we're not labeling people, we're not judging people. It's simply recognizing different folks come from different motivations. And each of us will come from different motivations at different times in our life. I mean, there's none of us that don't come from a deficiency motivation at some time or another. And most of us have experienced coming from a being motivation one time or another. So it's not about putting labels on people, but it's simply recognizing where our motivation is coming from. Is it to fill an emptiness, a lack, or is it to express one full being? Now, also I want to point out that we can't jump from here to here. So if you are experiencing a deficiency need, it's not a good idea to pretend it's not there and try to self-actualize, because that doesn't work. Again, these are hierarchical. The lower needs need to be met before the higher needs can be met. But they don't necessarily need to be met in the same way that we're used to them being met. And that's a key difference. Okay. In other words, let's say the love and belonging need. Maybe we're used to experiencing that in a certain way from other people. The need to feel loved is crucial for human development, but it doesn't have to look the way we necessarily think it should look. It can look a lot of different ways, you see. Okay, we'll go about 5 more minutes. Human growth. He's very interested in human growth. And these points are extremely important because many of the people that we work with in a pastoral setting are interested in growth. And they're interested not just in getting fixed, but they're interested in how can you be a catalyst. You, my minister, how can you be a catalyst for my growth and my spiritual awakening? So let's look at this idea of human growth. An interesting statement. Life is a never-ending series of choices between growth and defense against growth. Okay? So he's saying, and I'll paraphrase what he's saying, that in every moment we are choosing growth or defense. Again, we're not saying one is better than the other, but it's important to recognize that in each moment we are either opting to open, grow, learn, or we're functioning out of a more regressive, conditioned place. Growth is inhibited by 3 things. And the first one is a mouthful, but it's not as complicated as it sounds. Number one, the regressive influence of ungratified deficiency needs. Okay? In other words, if in our personal history we've experienced a deficiency in any of these, which most of us have, in our country typically it's more at this level here, maybe at the safety level. Until that deficiency, that unfulfilled deficiency need is addressed, we're not going to be moving upward very long. Okay? So, many people, I mean, this was my own experience many years ago when I came to Unity Seminary, was I was sure that I was I was standing right here, ready to blast off into the psychic stratosphere, okay? And 6 months later, I'm down at this level here. You know, my affirmation was, I want my mommy, you know. So I went from a whole and perfect, unlimited child of God to a 6-month-old infant, you see. And what we discover is our desire for growth is being met, but it's being met in a way we don't expect, because what's happening is for growth to take place, we need to heal the wounds of missing pieces of our development from the past. So that if we didn't get, and this is true for most of us, if we didn't get everything we needed as a child, then those unhealed wounds are going to show up. And that doesn't mean we need to relive our childhood necessarily, but it means those wounds need to be addressed. They need to be looked at and experienced in a different way. Growth is inhibited by the fear of pain and loss. So, there's a part of us that's always saying, well, yeah, in order to grow, I need to go beyond where I am. What's it going to cost me? You know, yeah, I'd like to do this, but, you know, if it costs me my marriage, or if it costs me my family, if it costs me my job, if it costs me my health, I'm not going to do it. So, if we fear there's going to be pain, if we fear there's going to be a loss, that will tend to inhibit our growth, and we'll tend to defend then against that growth. Now, oftentimes this fear of pain and loss is unconscious. In fact, most of the time that it is. We may be consciously pressing hard to try to move up, so to speak. But somewhere inside of us, there's part of us that's afraid to let go, because we're afraid of what it will cost us. Not necessarily in the present moment here and now, but from the eyes of a 5-year-old child or a 10-year-old child, you see. And finally, the third thing that inhibits growth is the attraction of safety and security where we are. You know, if we're fat, happy, and comfortable, who wants to grow? Spiritual growth is a great idea, but, you know, don't make me get up off the couch. But when we're in a position where there's little to lose, where we're uncomfortable, then we're more willing to step forward, you see. So it's a combination of how attractive is where I'm at, how scary is the place that I perceive I'm going next, and then, of course, again, what is the unfinished business of the past? So those are the things that inhibit growth. So anytime we're working with someone, i.e. ourselves sometimes too, anytime we're working with someone and we feel that growth is being inhibited or there's a chronic defense against growth, look for one of these three characteristics here, you see, because one or more of those will be present. And we'll continue next time with our discussion of the characteristics of human growth, but I think this is enough for today, so thank you.